thank you for being here. If you are here for the lecture, thank you. If you're not here for the lecture, sorry. My name is Mattie Colquhoun. Thank you to the Eidolon Centre for inviting me here. Thank you to Művház for having us. I'm here today to talk to you a bit about my latest book, Narcissus in Bloom. First, I'd like to tell you briefly about how I came to write the book, taking you on a brief journey through sort of the last 15 years with a relationship to photography. It wouldn't be a talk about narcissism without making it a little bit about me. But after this, I'd like to address the book's central reading of narcissism and how we can understand our propensity to look at ourselves in a more nuanced way than we're often allowed to do in the present, before connecting this to an understanding of the vernacular and the relationship that particular word has to everyday photography. That might sound like a bit of a leap, but I hope by the end of today you'll see the connection. I'm going to talk for about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll open for questions. First things first, the book's subtitle claims that it is an alternative history of the selfie, and that's true. It is a book that reconsiders the history of self-portraiture from painting to photography, but it's also a challenge to our preconceptions about what it means to look at ourselves. The main challenge that the book presents is that the presumption that we know ourselves, or that we show ourselves to the world with any certainty or arrogance as to who we are, more often than not, is mistaken. The art of the selfie, since it first gained prominence during the Renaissance, has seldom been an exercise in vanity, even when that appears to be its intent, but rather a kind of self-questioning, a self-investigation, a self-exploration of who we think ourselves to be via a kind of self-meditation. So the book offers a swift tour across a few hundred years of art history. And whilst it deals with the various changes, revolutions, cultural and technological shifts that have happened over so many epochs, the book argues that there's one thing that hasn't changed all that much, which is that we have always been uncertain as to who we are. And the overall conclusion to the book is that we do not, in fact, live in a narcissistic society, as we're so often told, a society that is vaingloriously self-obsessed, but rather that the sheer ubiquity of the selfie today suggests that we are more prone to questioning ourselves than ever before. There are many possible ways to approach this kind of self-questioning, this history of self-questioning. And in Narcissus in Bloom, I chose to look at it through the prism of art history. But this isn't my first attempt at exploring the implications of this kind of process. In truth, I've been thinking about the self, maybe myself, for a very long time, primarily as a photographer. And so I wrote Narcissus in Bloom because I had a lot of unfinished business with photography to attend to. Around 15 years ago, I arrived at a small university in Newport, South Wales, to begin a bachelor's degree in photographic art. And I vividly remember a lecture given by one of my tutors in my first year, suggesting to us undergraduates that it was likely we'd only ever have one interesting idea, but we'd find so many ways to explore it. I'm paraphrasing, but it was important advice, and advice that I often still think about because for me at least it has borne true. I do firmly believe that each of us, in whatever we hope to do, is fated to a problem that stays with us through an infinite number of permutations. And so drawing a line from then to now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about mine. I first started thinking about narcissism and its relationship to the self back when I was a student. I was taking quite a few selfies back then. This is one I took in the coastal town of Tenby in Wales in 2010, which I'm showing you for no other reason except that I've always liked it. But this is the photograph that started it all. It's a double exposure. The first exposure made was of my face whilst I stood in the kitchen of my student house in 2011. And I merged with a sad-looking bush in the back garden. A few years later, in 2015, I took another one, which you may have already seen. It's the first image featured in the book I would end up writing almost 10 years later, Narcissus in Bloom. What's notable for me, at least, is that these photos weren't really about me at all, or at least not entirely. When I first looked back at them whilst beginning to write Narcissus in Bloom during the pandemic, what I felt they were about or trying to achieve was a way of placing myself quite literally in the world, not as a person standing amongst things, but melded with them. I wanted to really be a part of something in a quite deep and entangled way, such that I wasn't a self that stood out from a background, but rather was lost within it and transformed by it. I had a particular thing for photographing myself in this way as a flower. By looking at these photographs, I thought back to another project that I made in my first year at university. I don't have any of the photographs anymore, but I took a series of pictures of myself in various outfits and wigs. I am an adoptee, and just before I arrived in Newport, I came into possession of a portrait of my birth mother, which I'd never seen before. She was 18 years old in the photo, just a year younger than I was when I arrived at university, and looked strikingly a lot like I did. That may not come as much of a surprise to most people looking at photographs of their relatives, but it did to me, because in that moment I'd never seen anyone who looked like me before. And so what I wrestled with initially in a lot of my naive student work was a way of making sense of myself not as an atomized individual, but as someone newly aware of their place in history, or at least someone else's history, the history of someone that I didn't know, in a way that probably went a little bit further than the average adolescent confusion about the world we live in. I turned away from selfies when it came to my own degree show, instead affirming a kind of childlike wonder at the world, looking for something, still something of a goth dressed in all black, but mostly being enthused about colour and vibrancy in the mundane, wanting to find the joy in everything. Like an alien to this planet not of terrestrial origin who hadn't yet been initiated into the state of things. Pointing my camera elsewhere, outside, but with an intentional naivety, relishing the joy of looking at mundane things, strangely, much like looking at my own family album as someone who felt outside of the genealogy it narrativized. Still, one thing, if there's a certain strangeness to, at this point, 10 years later, coming to another country to talk about my days as a student. The one thing I remember from that time, which has always stuck with me, is that at these various degree shows that people would have as students, as young photographers, as young students, is that there was always at least one selfie project on display. And you could always count on overhearing some disparaging comments made about them. You'd have various projects, maybe someone using their parents' money to photograph a war zone between academic semesters, or some other grand and arduous adventure into the post-colonial. And when I was a student, as might still be apparent, that was the sort of project that I personally had more of a problem with. I think I resented work that performed a kind of certainty about someone's place in the world. And so it seemed to me inappropriate. It seemed inappropriate to me that so much more cynicism was applied to any student who simply made use of what was most readily available to them, which was themselves. I'd also like to add that this sort of project was often made by a young woman, maybe exploring a nascent feminist politics by problematizing the beauty standards that a medium like photography is so often used to uphold. Perhaps some of the cynicism came precisely from the fact that these projects always carried an uncertainty and a sense of doubt within them, which may be taken as naivety, but it's an uncertainty that I think some photographers could probably do with having more of. In feeling this kind of insecurity, that the neat delineation between an individual and society that they are a part of soon becomes more blurred. And for me, as a young photography student indebted to a wider community active in that part of the world, it was a questioning of one's own embeddedness in a locality that really interested me. Beyond our various lectures on individual photographers and their historical influence, what I came away with wasn't a sense of individual genius as a young artist wanting to strike out on their own like any other acclaimed individual before them, but rather a sense of what Brian Eno famously calls scenius. That is, the understanding that any piece of work, no matter the individual name it is published under, is always in truth the product of a wider community in which one finds themselves. It was a realization that I only had at the end of my time in Wales, and I immediately knew that I wanted to have that kind of university experience again, that experience of a pedagogical commons where everyone present was committed to thinking collectively. Wales was only the beginning, so I took myself off to Goldsmiths in South London, knowing that what I really wanted to do was to think and write more, and in doing so insert myself into a new community. I've been reading the work of Mark Fisher and Kojo Eschen at that time on modernism, dance music, the black radical tradition, the future shock of jungle, the death of rave. Their work often dealt with this feeling that the time of cultural movements, the continuum of sceniuses that defined the 20th century was over. We don't have scenes anymore, not really, or not in the same way. Only a conveyor belt of exemplary individuals who often only retread the ground of those that has come before them. We were on the other side of the end of art history, and it felt more difficult in the 21st century to collectively birth the new. When I returned to university as a postgraduate in 2016, this was the fundamental problem that we were introduced to by our lecturers, but almost in spite of their pronouncements, I found a nice community there, which nonetheless felt tethered to a particular art world careerism, as if being an artist was enough. But when Mark Fisher died by suicide 3 months into my master's degree, everything changed. I felt a deep and powerful grief, which seemed to come from a contradiction I felt, and which we were all suddenly living through. Shortly after Mark's death, someone printed off a dozen copies of this poster, left them strewn around the university, featuring a quotation from his first book, 2009's Capitalist Realism. It reads, "Emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable." This was a hard thing to swallow, especially when read here, on the door of Mark's old office, as his absence now felt like the one thing we could never change. And for all our collective belief in his work, that was painful. But out of that grief grew a community of people who mourned not only Mark Fisher's death, but all of the lost futures that were scattered around us. It was possible, even necessary, to think through this new paradox at the heart of our lives, where an impossible return to a past in which Mark was still with us didn't need to be transformed into an impossible future where his work had no relevance. And it was necessary that we undertook this task together. My first book, Egress, on mourning melancholy and Mark Fisher, grew out of that situation. It was about the trajectory of Mark's thought at the time of his death, the ideas he was exploring with us, his students, but also a diary I kept in the aftermath, documenting the communal efforts to actualize new futures under the shadow of his death in 2017, but also Donald Trump's first electoral victory, Jeremy Corbyn's first electoral defeat, the Grenfell Tower fire, and a pervasive mental health crisis that seemed to be consuming all of us. I was still taking a lot of photos then too, continuing to give in to a documentary impulse to record everything. On the cover, for example, is a photograph of my friends walking back from a club night we organized to celebrate Mark's life and interest in music on the first anniversary of his death. But when that book was eventually published in March 2020, a week before the pandemic, at least a week before lockdown in the UK, and despite entering or centering a community that I was a part of so explicitly, even featuring a slither of it on the cover, that book's reception was admittedly mixed. The version of Mark Fisher that I wrote about was quite different to the one that had installed itself in popular consciousness, immortalized reductively on Wikipedia, as so many things are. And it took a couple more years of work on my part to further rectify his reputation, to unveil not the person he was thought to be, but the person he was becoming, something demonstrated by a further collection of Mark's final lectures, put together shortly after Egress came out, which was published in January 2021. What struck me, however, was that Egress was criticized by some for being too narcissistic, due to the fact that I'd written it in the first person. Narrating my personal experiences of a collective moment, which felt like the only way to address what had happened at the time. The central point was missed by some. Although the book began from personal experience, it was nonetheless oriented towards community, towards a kind of senius, which was struggling to sustain itself in the face of so much death and devastation. This is a tension that a lot of my work has explored ever since, arguably the same tension that interested me when I was an undergraduate photography student. And it was partly in response to this criticism that I wrote my second book, Narcissus in Bloom. Here, the perspective is inverted. If Egress was a book about community written in the first person, this is a book about the individual written in the third person. It is a book that considers how the self, the I, that we all are to ourselves, is often the starting point from which we set out to explore all that is around us. But it is only ever that, a starting point. When we enter into community, it is the self itself that is so often radically disturbed. When we try to situate ourselves in community with others, we necessarily grow, change, adapt, and become things other to what we once were. It is the greatest and most mundane experience available to all of us. It is something I first found when I arrived in Wales in 2010. It's something I found again in London. It's something I'm continuing to wrestle with as a PhD student, considering my personal experiences as an adoptee alongside a politics of family abolition. In this regard, I've long since accepted that I am fated to a problem, a single idea that I hope to explore from as many different angles as possible. That is the always incomplete and fractious co-development of the individual and the collective. What each of my books has attempted to do then, I think, or I hope, is to give an account of a kind of self-moving, a kind of becoming, when no character within it can be viewed the same by its end, whether that be an artist, a writer, or a community discussed, or even some vague idea of who I am as the person writing it. Each book for me starts with at the end of a certain kind of world, and each book ends on the threshold of a new one. It's a process of writing that has neatly fallen into a 3-year cycle for me, as that seems to be how long it takes to write these things. But it's a cycle that brings with it as much anxiety as it does euphoria. I am in truth the kind of person who finds change very difficult, and yet nonetheless remain fascinated by its relentlessness. Everything is always changing, and writing books has become one way in which I like to express the white-knuckle ride of uncertainty that is a life. But I also don't want to imbue this process with any kind of romanticism. I think it's something that we all find our own ways of dealing with, and I suppose, having given you this somewhat lengthy preamble about my own journey, what I really want to talk about today is the ways in which photography is another strategy for navigating our collective experiences in this way. As I guess I've already explained, I wrote Narcissus in Bloom because I felt I had a lot of unfinished business to attend to with regards to photography. I used to be a photographer, not by the measure of any kind of professional success, but simply because photography is what I used to do every day. Today, by that same measure, I'm a writer, and although I sometimes regret the back seat that photography has taken in my life over the last 6 or 7 years, I'm assured by a relentless compulsion to write that is no less a compulsion to document. For me, writing and photography aren't so different. They are two very different modes of documentation, but they scratch the same itch that is at the core of my person. This is not to suggest that this little history I've just given you is all-encompassing or can function as a resolute statement about who I am. It is only a gesture towards something other. In this sense, everything I've said so far is only a kind of preface. Modern philosophy has a real thing for prefaces. The most famous philosophical preface might be Hegel's preface to The Phenomenology of Spirit. It's a preface famous for its self-deprecating tone. Hegel tells his reader, I've just written this really fantastic book where I work through all of these really particular and knotted ideas about, where am I? About the nature of history and our experiences of it. And now I'm met with the task of summarizing these ideas for you glibly by way of an introduction, very much cut off from the work itself, in order to give you a sense of what you're about to read. But none of the work is actually here. The preface is unserious and unimportant. John Hippolyte once famously said, summarizing Hegel's preface, it only announces the project, but a project is nothing until it is realized. Jacques Derrida later makes a very big deal out of this, about how so many texts are structured in this way, with a preface given as a kind of abstract generality, distinct from the work undertaken, but nonetheless tasked with introducing it. A preface, then, is a kind of object that can be distinguished from the work itself, which constitutes more of a self-moving activity. My book is also laid out according to the same structure as so many books are. The introduction comes in 3 parts, in which the entire argument of the book is contained. The argument is that our understanding of narcissism, which is a kind of postmodern pathology that we all supposedly suffer from, encouraged by the presence of a camera in every pocket, isn't something to be moralized against. Instead, the book reframes narcissism as a form of self-questioning that is fundamental to human existence and the production of culture. We are all trapped in the seductive reflections of ourselves in so many pools, like Narcissus himself. And although these reflections might torment us from time to time, without such an experience, for better or for worse, we simply wouldn't make art. This isn't a new argument. Later in the book, I draw on Leon Battista Alberti, an art critic writing during the Italian Renaissance, who first claims that the tale of Narcissus is the primal scene of art history. We all feel an urge to capture that surface of the spring, implicitly aware of how contingent the images that appear before us really are. If we moralize against this kind of capture, it is due to the ways in which the tale of Narcissus has been curiously rewritten. In Ovid's classic telling of the tale, found in his tellingly named Metamorphoses, Narcissus isn't pulled into his own image, causing him to drown. Instead, he tears himself apart and is transformed into his namesake, a narcissus, a daffodil, that universal symbol of change, of seasonal new beginnings, and of spring. The tale of Narcissus, then, is not and never has been a story about vanity, but of self-reflection followed by self-transformation. That is the content of my book's preface. And once the argument is made, the work is undertaken to show how selfies have always been illustrations of this process, moving from Albrecht Dürer on the left, and Caravaggio through to Lee Friedlander on the right, and Hervé Guibert, Derek Jarman, and yes, in the end, inevitably, if briefly, myself. But there is perhaps something of a meta-commentary that can be extracted from this structure. Selfies are nothing but representations of the face, which is to say that selfies themselves are prefaces. That is how we use them. The selfies we upload of ourselves to social media websites and dating profiles are nothing but alluring hooks onto which we hope to capture the attention and attraction of others. And if modern dating is a travesty, perhaps it is because we all too easily forget the work that is to be entered into after we encounter a preface. A preface is only ever a reductive summary, and all that any writer can hope for in writing one is that we will follow it with a patience and determination, as we engage in the real work to come, which is a process of change and transformation, a splitting of the prefaced self from both sides, a change in both writer and reader, or photographer and viewer. To stick with the dating metaphor, what we really hope for, but so often are unable to attain, is a reciprocal engagement in the process of looking at each other. Derrida also writes about this. Narcissism, he argues, is not a one-way process, but a law that will allow two people to meet in the middle, to communicate. Love, for Derrida, is its own kind of narcissism, the narcissism of they look at each other, where the tormenting encounter between self and other is not encased within a hierarchy, whereby the self looms over the other who is lesser, but rather a recognition that in love, two narcissisms meet in the middle and become a narcissistic third, via a kind of love that announces from both sides that I love myself more when I'm with you. With this in mind, Derrida writes, you can only love yourself. We will not have understood anything about the love of the other, of you, of the other as such, you understand, without a new intelligence of narcissism, a new patience, a new passion for narcissism. The right to narcissism must be rehabilitated. It needs time and means. More narcissism, always more narcissism. The problem with narcissism, however, is that it is not all of its forms are beneficial to us. All of those who voted for Donald Trump again last week, for example, are not simply in love with a narcissist, we must understand, but are narcissistic themselves. All elections, in fact, are narcissistic to a degree and contain narcissisms of various types, produced at scales, each nested inside one another. We might recognize Trump as a narcissist quintessentially, but his love for himself, his supreme self-confidence, is only a vector through which the more general narcissism of nationalism can take root. We can understand Trump's attractiveness through the sense that he is an American who loves America, and so he becomes an example to all others who see themselves as patriots. This is to say that if you, as an American, truly love America, you must, above all else, relish your love for yourself. But again, rather than moralize against this kind of affectionate relation as an exception to a rule, we must recognize instead that this is an experience we have all had. It is the same narcissism that tells us, in matters of love, that we cannot love another until we love ourselves. And so rather than view narcissism as a particular moral ill affecting our world, as a pathology to be cured, we must acknowledge just how mundane narcissism really is, how essential it is. Narcissism is ever present and inescapable. And if we are better able to acknowledge its ubiquity in all of our lives, we might become better at actually addressing its effects properly, how it can be exploited by others who only love themselves, who only seek the attraction of others for their own benefit. What we really need, rather than the destruction of narcissism as such, is instead a more reciprocal narcissism, one that does not exclude the other, whoever we choose them to be, but rather includes the other most radically. I forgot I put that in there. At this juncture, I'd like to turn to the context in which we're all meeting today. We are here thanks to the organization of the Eidolon Centre for Everyday Photography, a centre with a particular interest in the vernacular and the banal. It's especially interesting to me that the Eidolon Centre on its website uses the latter word so openly. To call something banal, much like calling something narcissistic, is a provocation, since it immediately suggests that this word, in being given a kind of contradictory prominence, does not necessarily, in this instance, mean what we might think it means. If someone else were to call our interests banal, we'd likely take it as an insult. To be banal is to be uninteresting, unimportant, of little interest or significance. But immediately something happens when we proclaim that what interests us is uninteresting. The inclusion of vernacular, however, soon changes things. The word vernacular already has a kind of renewed significance in the context of photography. Vernacular photography is a kind of photography that is unprofessional, perhaps, a kind of photography that is other. It is a term often associated with family archives or touristic photography, the sorts of image, like this one here, that is taken without much thought in everyday situations. It is perhaps, in this way, more inherently narcissistic, in some sense of the word, than any other kind of photography. Vernacular photography exists outside of all art historical deferrals to form and convention. It conveys a naive but no less enchanting mode of looking. Vernacular photography, in this case, best expresses photography's own vernacular, which in the context of everyday speech relates to slang words, local dialects, minor languages, the cutting edge of contemporary expression. It is through the vernacular that we see what photography is in itself without borrowing from painting or any other medium. What we find in vernacular photography then is often more poignantly a photographic poetics. Vernacular photography, perhaps more than any other kind of photography, gives us a sense of an age, an era, a present, the moment in which it was made. It contains a reflexivity that is narcissistic most fundamentally. But what strikes us when we look at so many vernacular images is just how eclectic our tastes and sensibilities and modes of expression can be. It is through a vernacular photographic it is through the vernacular that we come to see not the formal repetition of artistic convention, but a plethora of informal and acutely photographic differences. To read a vernacular photographic selfie, and perhaps the only thing that makes the selfie differ from the more formal self-portrait is its vernacular nature, is to glimpse how the people of a particular moment view themselves and the world around them, and how differently we come to see ourselves in whatever moment we encounter such an image. What is vernacular is personal, is different, is minor, perhaps even contrary to an accepted and hegemonic way of looking at things. And when forms of vernacular meet, a totally new vision of the world arises. Modernist literary practices were particularly interested in the vernacular. We might think of James Joyce's Ulysses, which drifts in and out of a specifically Irish vernacular, and of poetic attempts to describe a present moment, but which nonetheless enters into conversation with Homer's Odyssey as a modern retelling of an ancient tale, where we are invited to enter into a paradox whereby great literary works of collective consciousness contain their own undoing in the privileging of an individual's all-too-individual journey. Ezra Pound, too, in his poetry, melds a modern vernacular with the first vernacular poetry of the troubadours, entangling what is ancient and what is modern via a doubled alterity of what was vernacular then and what is vernacular today, translating one vernacular into another, making both moments appear strangely to us. Narcissus in Bloom attempts a similar approach. The history it provides both clarifies a vernacular continuity between different eras of self-expression, aided by new technologies of mediation, and how they change the ways in which we see ourselves with their accumulated mass of individual perspectives stretching out a collective present. What we find when looking at the vernacular most explicitly, and particularly that vernacular form called the selfie, is that ours is a society of differences, far from a utopia, but certainly a heterotopia. And I'd argue that these are not differences that need to be resolved, subtracted down to some sentimental humanism that suggests we are all alike deep down. We are infinitely different from each other, and this is our virtue. Somewhat counterintuitively, it is not our differences that divide us, but rather a logic of individualism that cannot make peace with our own divided nature, that rejects the hard work of that our differences announce to us, differences that make ethical demands upon us as we seek a solidarity without similarity. Thinking about all of this is the problem that I personally feel fated to, but again, it's not just my problem, it's a problem that we all share. And I hope that this book will in some way, will go some way towards demonstrating this. initiating certain conversations that I think we are all eager to have. Excuse me. An eagerness demonstrated by the ubiquity of selfies themselves. A discussion that will only take place properly if we allow ourselves to ignore an ideology of individualism that reduces narcissism to a preoccupation with the self, when the tale of Narcissus has always been about the moment the self encounters the other, even the self as other, and is changed by it. Vernacular photography also does this as well. Vernacular photographs are the photographs that we all take, that we are all able to take. But rather than these images all being the same, they contain an altered familiarity that changes us. Just as Mark Fisher argued that we must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable, it is possible for us all to begin such a project by starting with ourselves, selves that appear to us so incessantly and so much more strangely than we care to acknowledge, selves that are not necessarily and inevitably one thing or another, but are rather in the progress of, or in the process of undergoing so many contingent becomings. Change is not impossible then, because we change every day. And I think our selfies are one way in which we attempt to come to terms with and even document these changes. We shouldn't dismiss them as exercises in self-obsession, but as something quite other, because ultimately we still do not know who we are. Thank you.
Here comes the part when you can ask questions from Mattie, and I do hope some of you have questions. Should I hand the microphone to anyone? If not, I do have questions though. So I will start asking questions, and if you feel like, please join in. It's quite weird, so I will just... I'm really curious about your take on why we do take selfies every day, of course, and that is the logic of the platform, and I do feel like it's not a good feeling to go to the platform every day and upload new photographs, but we still do it. What's your explanation for this through the lens of narcissism?
I mean, I guess it's something that we have always done. Maybe not all of us, but the book kind of charts this history where we can see from the very, like even prehistoric art, we can see there is an attempt to represent or self-represent, not necessarily the individual, but a community. We've always done it, and I guess the means in which we sort of celebrate that process, like painting initially, where we have this, and again, this is something that comes up in the book, where this notion of the individual that we have today is very, very recent. We've only really thought about ourselves as individuals since about 500-600 years ago. And that kind of comes with painting in the Renaissance and is carried forward to today, but the means by which we can capture ourselves is now so ubiquitous. We are all capable of doing it. And rather than, I think, it's easy to suggest that we take photographs of ourselves and post them because platforms encourage us to. I think we have taken photographs of ourselves constantly regardless. I think it's rather that this kind of platform capitalism latches onto that desire for its own sake, to make, this suggestion that we're all kind of workers in the social media economy. We upload data of ourselves willingly that is then commodified, and our selfies are a part of that. But that doesn't mean that selfies in themselves are bad. It's kind of what is being done to them or with them as a kind of, exploiting this interest that we have quite naturally, I think, in not just looking at ourselves, but wanting to retain some kind of memory of who we were at a particular moment. That's the thing that torments Narcissus. He's never seen himself. He comes across himself in a pool. And what he struggles with in the original version of the story is that he knows that when he leaves the pool, he will lose his image, as if he'll never see himself again. And it's that drives him to change into something else, into, a daffodil, a flower that comes and announces to its sort of the world, to the collective, a new time has come, and that will wilt again. And the tale of Narcissus is this kind of, it's not a moral tale about vanity. It's a tale about, the difficulty of accepting change, but the necessity of doing so. And I think the photographs that we take of ourselves, like the paintings or whatever else, are our own way of doing it. They're our own way of coming to terms with how much we change. There's an irony to that platform capitalism likes to seize upon that, because all it wants is stasis. I think that's maybe why the tale has been rewritten. But yeah, why do we do it? I think it's just partly like that's it's a cultural impulse, but it is exploited.
And as I think we all know, selfies are a great tool to link the self over time. But it's a history that you have to seek intentionally if you want to look back on it. So I have mixed feelings regarding my old selfies because, of course, I don't feel the same person as I felt in 2018, let's say. And of course, I never seek those selfies. And a lot of people tend to say that previous selfies of ours become kind of digital and visual waste. What's your take on that? Do you think it's actually visual waste, or is it great for safekeeping and sometimes taking the time to look back at them and maybe turning them into a proper archive?
I mean, that's an interesting question for you to ask as someone who runs a centre for everyday photography. So I guess you know the answer. Those archives are important. I think it's easy to... I think that's a problem, again, with... what to do with that is it digital waste, or is it that we don't know what to do with like a digital overabundance? I think what is so attractive and kind of romantic about looking at more material archives, I guess books and paper and old photo albums and things like that, is that we're aware of how rare they are, but we treasure them now because they give us an insight into a past moment that we wouldn't necessarily have. And now maybe there's this tension that we feel where there is such an overabundance of images, especially of ourselves, that as if we're not able to leave that past behind. I guess that's kind of in relation to your last question. Like that's that tale of Narcissus being a story about how the difficulty of accepting change, and the irony that selfies are kind of seen as this very capitalist kind of mode of self-expression and self-representation. But maybe that's why we can't escape those. We're not allowed to change in the same way, or maybe we struggle to. When you see an old photograph of yourself, maybe you're embarrassed by. I mean, I think we all have that, right? You're embarrassed by how much you have changed, or how much you needed to change. And I think it's easy to be embarrassed of it when it's yourself, but then. I it's kind of the example of the photograph of my birth mother. Like that's if we did meet a few years later, if she knew that I'd shown that photo to a room full of people, she'd be mortified. But to me, it's like the most important photograph that I have. And trying to think about, it's not a self-portrait, but it's a portrait of someone at a very strange time in their life. And I guess so there's that question of when things like that kind of photograph is rare, we know that we don't have those in abundance. What do we do with the overabundance of images? I don't know. But I think surely, you know, I guess it's that sense of. I had someone asking me about this at another talk recently. That was what we love about those more material archives is we are also, I guess, partly aware that those photographs often, like say they were taken on film, we're aware that that is a kind of outdated technology, and there's a romanticism and a kind of real allure to having an image that was made by now quite unpopular means. But then what does it mean now when everything can be digitized, everything can be restored, everything can be given in 4K HD? If we do that to everything, do we lose that sense of history? Do we then just have a kind of, do we homogenize culture that to always look a certain way? And I guess what's partly the reason for invoking Mark Fisher here, I guess, is his suggestion, you know, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But I guess what Mark talks about in that sense is that given that example of restoration of images, the HDifying of all culture, can we see technological progress beyond that? Can we get into higher definition? Have we kind of reached the impasse where this is just what everything will look like now? I can't imagine that's true, but it's hard to imagine what new kinds of images will look like. And I think I'm kind of hopeful that we will find that digital abundance. We will find kind of flaws in the images that we have now that will be so indicative, probably maybe because of their content. We will be fascinated by this overabundance maybe in decades to come, because we go to those archives to try and understand something about that time. How will we understand the present when it has been so excessively documented? Will that make us better historians, more intelligent in reflecting on the time that we're in? Maybe not, but maybe that's quite optimistic. But I think that's only a question that we can maybe answer in the future when the ways that we are making images does change again. And maybe it will, because it's already changed a lot over the past 10, 20 years. And who knows what will happen again in 20 years' time. And then I think we'll be very precious about that digital waste. Like, you know, people going on digs and digging up old Roman rubbish or whatever. That waste will become really interesting again.
And as you mentioned, paper-based archives, I'm quite curious, how did your research look during your process writing this book? Because of course, because of consumerism, we see a lot of talking heads and selfies on social media, even without seeking them. So what kind of images did you look at? And did you spend more time on social media just because of the book, or you spent enough time already and that helped you enough to write the book?
I guess it's probably not a coincidence that it's a book about narcissism that was written during the pandemic. It was written inside during a very lonely couple of years, kind of by virtue of not really having much else to think about or reflect upon than the self. But I think I think what was sort of so maybe the pandemic, I don't know how it was here, but there was a lot of conversations at that time that were, I think a lot of people were sort of questioning their daily habits, not only in the sense that there was a virus to look out for, but, and this wasn't universally the case, but, people reflecting on how they can what they can do themselves to better look after their community. A real sort of sense that this thing we called society has kind of been put on hold. We've never been more atomized. But trying to understand then, what happens when this ends? What that we've reflected on and learned about ourselves can we do to change things for the better? Maybe it doesn't feel like that thinking went very far. It feels like everything went back to normal for better and for worse. I guess I was also spending far too much time on social media at the time. But I think it was just this question. There was this abundant sense that everybody, and especially in the aftermath of Donald Trump's first presidency, everything was narcissistic. And I kept hearing it being that term being thrown around more and more. And then maybe in a certain way, I wasn't looking at many images at all, because the images were there. You didn't have to go and look at those for research. I guess it was more the main body, the main research that went into the book was looking at how we've thought about how we thought about narcissism differently. And the book does chart the history of that term. Maybe I didn't define it that well in the presentation. I kind of don't want to just sort of in too much, just give, read the book, please. I don't want to kind of give too much of a summary of it, but there is this sense that like narcissism as a pathology was first coined by someone whose name I can't remember, in the late 19th century, a psychoanalyst. It wasn't Freud, someone before Freud, and it was a pathologization of homosexuality. The original narcissists were men who loved other men. It means, to love the same. And Freud changes it, and Freud says that we all kind of have this this love of ourselves is when narcissism becomes a problem. It's when that relationship between self and world is broken down. But we are all it's that kind of classic psychoanalytic play where what seems like a bad thing and a pathology is actually just trying to describe something that is common to all of us. And what happens when the kind of balance, the narcissist within us all kind of takes over. And that was sort of Freud's interest. And you have this sort of changing over time where the book especially kind of looks at, I guess, the relationship between both of those two origin stories, Freud's version, this other version. And I think what you find in a lot of later sort of 20th century artistic countercultural currents is you find a kind of reclaiming of narcissism by queer communities especially. The men who love other men who have been pathologized as narcissists, they reclaim this and they look at themselves far more explicitly. I guess to and this will be the last point, but how that was relevant in lockdown was that I was looking at the work of Hervé Guibert, who was the photography critic at Le Monde in the 70s and 80s, I think, rumored to have been a lover of Michel Foucault and Roland Barthes, who died of AIDS in the early 90s and became very famous in France because he wrote a memoir of his experience and photographed himself through it and filmed himself. And there was this relationship there to how one individual, a gay man, an original narcissist, was looking at himself in the midst of an epidemic, an AIDS epidemic. I think there's a kind of clunky comparison to be made there between AIDS and coronavirus. But a lot of Guibert's works were reissued in English in the US, and that conversation sort of started to happen. People thinking about this sense that there is a history here of individuals really, really thinking about themselves in the midst of a dangerous virus for the sake of their own community. And maybe because of how that's been, marginalized, pathologized as negatively narcissistic, that the lessons learned from that time weren't really carried over into a pandemic that affected all of us. But we kind of found ourselves 40 years later thinking about those same questions. The ones that were originally just for gay men were now all of ours. And narcissism's had the same sort of thing. It was originally just about gay men, and now we're all narcissists. And it's that kind of history that the book ends up telling in the second half through photography. But that was kind of the most, at least for me, the most interesting part of the research related to the pandemic anyway. So I guess it was not so much about social media itself, but what could inform that moment, because the conversation being had about our narcissistic selves on social media was pretty reductive and for me quite annoying. It didn't really say anything, and I hope this book speaks to that moment and says more. I guess it's just trying to unearth we all know the negative version, and that's the one we refer to most, but the history of that term is far more complicated. And yeah, there are these examples of people talking about narcissism very positively. I think maybe the book is, at its most provocative, it kind of, I guess, as I was doing in the talk, maybe it is provocative to say we need more narcissism, we need to become more narcissistic. That seems to be the last thing that we need. But because we only focus on this one negative part of it, when you look at how that term and the tale of Narcissus has been understood, it has fundamental questions about human experience and existence, about being in love, about self-care, about it's not just all this kind of a fixation on the self for your own self-betterment. There is a narcissism of, maybe it's this. The Freud has the example of like a depressive narcissism can come from. It could be delusions of grandeur. It could be hypochondria, but depression fundamentally is narcissistic, where say something happens and you question your own place in the world. It can be, narcissism can be also hating yourself. It can be just simply focusing on yourself too much. But often, even at the same time, there is, he argues that there is a place for it. It's when narcissism is out of balance that it becomes a problem. But we wouldn't get anywhere if we didn't think about ourselves a little bit in relation to the other people around us. And I guess the book kind of gives a bit of that history of that term in terms of psychoanalysis or philosophy, but tries to apply it to photography. Like, if that's the history of this term that we don't really know about or think about, how does that change how we look at something as ubiquitous as the selfie? And maybe, I wouldn't say it's neutral, but maybe it's more balanced, or there's more nuance to it at least. Like, I think if we thought about that word a bit more carefully, we might be better at addressing some of the problems that do arise from narcissism of various types. Not that it's a thing to be cured, but I think there's that kind of sense that maybe on an extra level, narcissism as a global thing is out of balance because we only talk about the negative side. But what other problems can be addressed, or what can be changed if we understood how we've previously understood that word better? That's probably a garbled response. I hope the book presents that argument in a way that's a bit more fluid, and via art history, because I think that's just a kind of fun and useful way to do it. But not just the negative side. And I think it's trying to overcome that all like overlooming, all-encompassing version that doesn't help us, I don't think. But thank you for your question. I think so. I think it has been. That was partly my interest in a lot of Mark Fisher's work. I think I've been running a blog that's actually down at the moment. I need to pay up my subscriptions. But I've had a blog for about 20 years of various different names. And I remember in the early 2000s, there was this kind of international blogosphere that certain people became most famous from, like Mark Fisher, or someone like Simon Reynolds, whose books about music are amazing. There was this community there of individual blogs where people could write whatever they wanted, but they had conversations and they joined together. And that was a certain kind of genius, I think. If that doesn't happen anymore, I think it's because of that was kind of the Wild West of the internet, when we didn't have these kind of gravity wells of platforms. Like, you're no one if you're not on Twitter or on Facebook, but there was a kind of anonymity then to the internet where, you know, I think now we become very nervous about people that are anonymous online or trolls online or whatever else. But what was interesting about the internet at first, I think, and that kind of community, what interested me about it as well, was that everyone kind of knew that you were always wearing a mask, and you could post on music forums or blogs or the early versions of, I don't know, like MySpace or something, and you kind of all knew that every one of those platforms was a different mask. There was no question of anyone being interested in authenticity. It was all kind of play with identity, changing identity, transforming yourself for different contexts. And I think when people did that collectively together, it gave rise to some really interesting internet culture. I think we struggle to do that now, but again, it's kind of because of these platforms that have seen that that's how we like to do things, what people are interested in doing, and have kind of exploited it and kind of captured it for their own profitability. Whether it's still possible to have a kind of online seniors, I think that's hard, and I think if it's difficult to have that kind of sense of a collective cultural movement anymore, it's kind of for the same reasons. Certain individuals and certain things get pulled out for the sake of profit. But then I guess it's different in different spaces. I mean, Rosa was giving us a tour on the taxi over and talking about, you know, this neighborhood. He's saying there's like a reductions in rents for people that want to do cultural activities. That sounds like a dream compared to what we're talking about in the UK. I'm sure it's not perfect, but fighting for that bare minimum is like that's something that a lot of friends are kind of working towards. That's impossible to do that kind of thing. And it always comes back to questions of profit and profiteering, and it sucks. But it does. What those problems that we've seen happen in space, in concrete, on our streets. The internet's weirdly gone the same way, I think. And yeah, maybe there's some opportunities to claw that back in our own neighborhoods. How we do that online is a different question, but I think that's something we'll have to address sooner rather than later if we want that kind of collective scene to be possible there again. I guess the focus on narcissism is only because that's kind of the first thing that people go to. And as if to say that if we want to enter those other spaces, to think about selfies in other ways, maybe a good place to start is to dismantle this fixation on narcissism first and foremost. And then maybe in doing that, you see all these other ways that selfies are really useful to people and interesting. I was talking about the book maybe a few months ago with, it was a podcast about psychoanalysis or therapy. It wasn't recorded very well, and it wasn't a very good podcast. But there was one woman on that who was asking questions who was really interesting for me to talk to anyway. She was a therapist who worked with people struggling with mental health conditions, but especially with addiction of various kinds. And she talked about how taking selfies was a kind of really important therapeutic tool for, I guess, if you have struggled with addiction or some kind of difficulty where maybe you have a really hard time overcoming and, you know, continuing to love in a certain way the person that you were before, and that being a really difficult thing for people that do struggle with addiction to deal with. And she was sort of talking about how it was that was such an interesting an essential tool for her in that context, which I guess is more existential, that is related to a whole different other context, but wanted to kind of and that context for her, a very minor context, already changed how she viewed selfies. She'd maybe look at people that were taking selfies online and maybe be worried about some of that behavior, noticing that there was something either going wrong or something had gone wrong, and it was their way of reclaiming themselves for the future. And seeing that being far more common, that really there's this sense that we apply this label of narcissist or narcissism to certain people who might be sharing too much of themselves, whatever that too much is, against, I mean, some sort of sense of online politeness, or, you know, what's the right amount of sharing of yourself you should do. But actually seeing, you know, that it's, we can still call it narcissistic, but it's not to just say that that person is self-obsessed. Maybe that's really helping them get over something. And so there's, I guess, a part of reclaiming this term. So yeah, we can talk about those other things. And actually be a bit more gentle towards each other, maybe, or a bit more patient, a bit more forgiving of the reasons why we might look at ourselves. And there's many different reasons why, and some of them are very valid and very healing. And I guess it's, scraping away narcissism in a way to make space for those things to come through.